We're too far apart.
Well,
We're too far apart. Well,
absence makes the heart grow fonder, Michael.
Well, very simply, we went to school as school goes 48 years ago at Columbia Journalism School in New York. And we were very, very close friends. We saw Neil Armstrong land on the moon. It was probably real. It was probably real. We had that evening Vindaloo curry, which we enjoyed more than Neil Armstrong, I believe. And then, over the years, I was living in London, and Indy came to London to make a return of Vindaloo curry. We spent, Vlas and I spent 2 days cleaning the ceiling from your cooking. It was very good, by the way, but hard work.
Yeah, that was when you were living one floor below Sam Shepard, right?
That was one of your first visits. That was in Hampstead, in 62 Pilgrims Lane. And when you came the second time, with sort of a cooking fanatic, that was also in Hampstead, but that was in South Hill Park.
Yeah, I made sure that Blaster married you.
A different address. What can I say? Inder left journalism school. He has absolutely pure journalism blood. His grandfather was the first Indian to visit the North Pole. And he was a very great journalist. We went different ways in life, But Inder was in America for at least 20
little over 20 years, yes.
20 years. He's became an American citizen, and his wife Shama. We were very deeply close to each other, and this is carried over the years. But what's very important to say is that after Columbia Journalism, Inder went to a 20th Century Fund as an editor to commission books, and then made his way to Washington. He became a very well-known journalist in Washington. And I'll ask him a few questions about that, but in 1975, working for Jack Anderson, you broke the story of the American and Russian submarines colliding in, I believe, the North Sea. Yeah. Many stories and many scandals. The Army Times, the Washington, D.C. So let's go to Washington from New York. Tell us a little bit about your experiences in Washington.
Well, it was a difficult transition, Michael, because in New York, while in journalism school, I'd remained not a journalist, but actually a poet. I wrote lots and lots of very bad poetry. Some of it was published in obscure journals. And the first time I got almost respectable was when the Evergreen Review decided to publish my first short story. And for some reason, I have no idea why, they dropped it at the last moment. That was possibly the biggest disappointment of all my life, because that was possibly the best short story I ever wrote. It was called No Exit. I won't go into it now, but basically it's a very funny story. It was a very idealistic Western, an American, who thought that he wanted to escape the materialism of the West and wanted to go settle down in India in a very Tolstoyan fashion and become agrarian once again and become a farmer and go back to his roots. And he found out that the first thing he couldn't do was he didn't know how to shit. He had to squat in a field. There were no chawns. You didn't sit comfortably. You had to squat. His knees gave way, and he returned to America a very disappointed man. And the story was called No Exit. And so
I think Allen Ginsberg read the story. He flew immediately to
well,
India.
I was influenced by Bukowski when I did that kind of thing because it was guys like Bukowski and crazy guys like Harold Pinter, and these guys who influenced me. But anyway, I took the shortcut, which most of us do, a lot of us do, and became instead of my true calling, I retreated into journalism. And by happenstance, I became an investigative journalist. And actually, apart from that collision of those ships, the story that I was best known for, out of a series of things I did, was an expose on the FBI, which J. Edgar Hoover had made into an institution that was so venerable. He saw a television series on it, The Incorruptibles and this kind of thing. And I saw another side of the FBI in which it had started behaving like a secret police, more like the NKVD or like the KGB, and was actually had an enemies list of pro Kennedy, anti-Jimmy Carter Democrats, which it targeted for investigation by planting money on them, tempting them to the extent that they couldn't resist the temptation anymore, and they filmed them trying to accept these bribes from FBI agents posing as Arab sheikhs. The operation was known as Abscam or Arab Scam. And I was first rather kind of enamored of the fact that a lot of crooks, big senators and congressmen would go to jail, and some of them did. But then I was horrified at the idea of incriminating people who had absolutely no predilection towards any kind of crime. And from having first exposed the FBI heroism in going after powerful politicians, I turned in the other direction. I turned 360 degrees around and started writing very nasty stuff about the FBI. Of course, there was a price to pay for that. My wife suffered. She was frightened to death because Shama, who's here in the audience, would receive all kinds of calls saying that, we are right across the street watching you. That's scary. It hasn't happened to you. Believe me, it's very scary. They would replay conversations that I'd had with my sources. I don't know how they'd recorded them, but Shama would pick up the phone and she would hear these recordings of my voice talking to my sources. I mean, these weird ways of scaring you. But anyway, I didn't wind up in a cellar with a bullet through my head like darkness at noon. It didn't happen in those days in America. But nor did it frighten me away from further investigations. But it did, of all things, I mean, that was one of the good things about America. It did earn me a nomination for a Pulitzer. Of course, it was a very unpopular story because it went against the grain of what everybody in America was writing about. I mean, I was villainizing the heroic institution, and it was politically unpopular, and for anybody like that to ever actually receive a Pulitzer for a story like that. It didn't happen.
If we jump cut, in a sense, for our generation, we jump cut to the generation now, to journalism now, to this concept of fake news. What parallels do you see? Are there parallels? Is there a great gap between the journalism of the 1960s and the journalism today?
Michael, I think it depends on individuals, and I mean there are people like Larry who is with the festival. I don't know if he's here today or not. who has had the guts to put into perspective a very soft white underbelly of America. Now, some may say that that's it's always existed, and that and all that's happened is he's brought that into relief. There are people like Seymour Hersh, who's just purely a journalist, and he Seymour looks at. He's a good friend of mine, but I've said this to Seymour's face, that he looks at subjects that will pay him, will make money for him, like a novelist who will look at the money first and the subject later.
But he started with the My Lai massacre in 1967.
Yes, that was a very brave person. I mean, and also it showed the kind of resilience that America had. That I don't see that now, and that's where I see this huge change. And that's the answer to your question. During the Vietnam War, in the 60s, late 60s, the one thing that absolutely startled me, and which is a message I conveyed to the rest of the world through articles, talks, and this kind of thing, was the incredible tolerance for dissent that America had. I mean, I really cannot imagine a country today, especially Trump's America, or any other kind of America, in which people would actually, in the middle of a war, would actually carry signs to Washington after the invasion of Cambodia, saying, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is, whatever the acronym was, North Vietnam, is going to win. And this is the middle of a war. People actually walking down the streets of Washington, cheering for the enemy. There was not a store in the East Village or on Washington Square, and even in downtown Manhattan, what is now known as Tribeca, where stores did not carry huge posters showing Nixon, who's then president, with a Pinocchio-like nose growing every day, and Nixon spelled with a swastika, with a N-I, swastika, O-N. And at one time, actually, the Attorney General, John Mitchell, his wife, Martha, I remember doing this story because someone told me about it. She peeped out the window, and when she saw this huge crowd gathering to protest the war, because it was and I don't need to go into that because there's millions and millions of books written on that, and thought that actually the October Revolution was at hand. And they said it's about time that, like the Tsars fled, that it was about time that it's about time that the Nixon administration should flee. And he was, Seymour Hersh was actually a part of that generation. I mean, this was symbolic of what was happening then. And in the middle of this, here's Seymour Hersh that actually describes a massacre of innocent men, women, and children in a village called My Lai, led by a person by the name of Captain Calley, where people were just slaughtered. He exposed that, and even then, the New York Times wouldn't carry it. No one carried that story. So he gave it to a very, very small newspaper. It was known then as the alternative press, called the Dispatch News Service. They carried a small item, the My Lai massacre, and actually the larger papers were shamed into carrying that story, and of course it became an iconic piece of journalism that is still taught all over the world. But that was the America I knew. It was an America that was tremendously tolerant. It was hugely tolerant for dissent. It put up with people like me and Michael, for example, and even guys like Tom Leslie, who's here now.
So Nothing's changed.
Well, no, things have changed, Michael. I don't really see that happening now. I don't see that kind of thing happening now because the social media has changed so much. We discussed that the other day. That's a different subject.
Let's cut to India.
Yeah.
Okay, you in America, Washington, took in the sights, and went back to India. Why did you go back to India, and what happened? Very briefly, why did you return, and what happened with your life there?
Well, Michael, I did not actually go to America as an immigrant or escaping poverty, looking for a job. I went there actually in pursuit of the woman I loved who lived there. She's sitting right here right now. I went there to get married to her. She was living there. I'd met her in India. And as luck would have it, I got admission to Columbia University. And both things kind of worked out. And by the time I looked at my watch, it was 22 years later. And
it's Burroughs' favorite number.
Yeah, but I had a great time because I was. This is difficult for a lot of people to say, but and I've been asked this question very often. That did you ever experience any racism there? I mean, here it was, this crazy brown-skinned gypsy-looking guy, hanging around the Pentagon and doing exposés on American corruption, and I imagine that there'd be this redneck thing saying, what the hell are you doing interfering in the affairs of my country? Then get out, go back to India. For some reason, a lot of people may have it. I did not. I can say that, but with absolute certainty, I did not experience personally. It's a smidgen of a racist attitude or any kind of racist rejection, which I was always very grateful. A lot of people did. I didn't, perhaps because I spoke better English than most of them.
In India, you're exposing scandals again, and there are many scandals. And of course, you're against nationalism. Tell us just briefly about your life in India.
Well, see, going back to India was that I felt that part of the adventure in America was over. It was half the adventure was over.
Your ballroom days.
Yeah, and it was like another adventure was about to start, and there is in all of us, well, at least in me, there's a slight feeling of evangelism that I would take back a lot of the nicest things I knew about America, which was basically tolerance for dissent, right? I take that back into India, because the last time I'd been in India, it was during a very dark time in Indian democracy, which was called the emergency period under Mrs. Gandhi, where democracy and virtually all fundamental rights had been suspended completely, and the opposition was in jail, and people were scared.
It sounds like Turkey today.
Yes. It was very similar. It was very similar, except that it ended because Mrs. Gandhi, I think, misled by her own coterie of advisors, because the press had shut down. There was no other way of her getting any kind of information as to how unpopular this was, and she really thought that she was riding a crest of popularity. And she ordered an election and was booted out. She was kicked out, and Indian democracy was restored. Now, I went there much after that actually had happened. And the Indian, there was a flowering, a renaissance of journalism in India at the time. I wanted to be a part of that. I also wanted to be a part of what my guru, my mentor, Jack Anderson, had taught me. That look, Indy, Go to the world and preach. Tell them that, look, here's the best of what journalism is about. And I did believe in I had heroes in America, people like Ida Tarbell, the so-called the muckraking, writers of America, people who wrote the book on Standard Oil, this kind of thing, and I thought that this is something that I could bring to Indian journalism, and there was a magazine there which represented this new India, India Today, and I was editor of that magazine for many years. But the other thing was to see if this duality of experience, being both American and Indian, could ultimately produce in me the writer that the birth pangs were going on and on for a very long time, and I felt that perhaps this symbiosis could ultimately apotheosize into literature.
Do you think democracy is being questioned in a different sense today? People are turning away from democracy. They're questioning democracy. Do you feel that's true?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true.
Why?
Because it hasn't solved their problems at a spiritual level, at a very intellectual level. Yes, it's something that's utterly desirable. It's the ethical holy grail to which we as human beings must all aspire. There's no question about that in my mind. No question about it in my mind. But it's also very easy to fall into the trap to say that, look, China delivered because it was an autocracy, and look where they've gone. They hold more than half of America's debt. It's become the manufacturing hub of the world, and they've given people food to eat. They say the same. Of course, they ignore the fact that during the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward of Mao, there were millions and millions of deaths. People died of starvation. They talk about Stalin's huge industrialization and his 5-year plans, and say that he put all Russians back to work. And there are people I know even in the Czech Republic who remember the Social Security that they had, when the communists held sway here. And there's a lot of sentimentality about that, even though the communists have come down from 13% vote to, I think, about 8%. But at the same time, it's like going back to the womb, but without realizing some of the horrors, because you see, the control was so great that you did not know about the famine of Ukraine. Not many people know about the famines that were created in Ukraine, where millions and millions of people were actually, their crops were taken away, stolen from them, and they were eating shoe leather at one point. They talk about the fact that look, Cambodia and Vietnam, they were under totalitarian rule. Look at them now, but they forget the horrors of Pol Pot. So to me, there's no question about it. I would much rather starve as a free Democrat than thrive as a fat cat living under a dictatorship. I couldn't personally live under a dictatorship. It's suicidal for me.
Inder's here. Everyone's really welcome to speak with him, because there are many more things to say. Many more things to say, including why the Russians are not celebrating the Russian Revolution after 100 years. But that's something else. When we were together, we didn't speak about journalism or the Russian Revolution or the forthcoming war between China and India. We spoke about literature. And you were crazy about literature. You were crazy about Henry Miller. Henry Miller.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're still crazy about Henry.
Of course.
Okay. So
Of course.
let's listen to...
I'm also in love with June.
Hmm?
I'm also in love with June. How many people here know her?
It's November.
What was her name? June Mansfield.
It's November, it's not June. Remember November? It's actually the celebration of the end of the First World War on the 11th of November. So people are speaking about June, but not the First World War.
But also Kerouac and Ferlinghetti and, a whole bunch of other people like that.
Why don't you read for us something? His first novel, which was called Sniffing Papa. And now that I've lost my sense of smell, eyesight, hearing, it's wonderful to hear from Sniffing Papa. And then they changed the title in the paperback, and also especially in France, to The Chamber Perfumes. So Inder will read from his first novel.
Yeah, let me. I'm glad Michael asked some of these questions. It's important to put an author in perspective, which I think he's done marvelously well by.
I never do that.
Well, you brought me out, which is something my wife doesn't always succeed in doing, and I think she knows me better today than had I not been here. I think she's smiling. Well, it was called Sniffing Papa because, in a sense, Papa, he could have been my father, he could have been your father. He's a morphed character. He's a strange character. A character that I think very few people outside of India, except perhaps who've lived in India, especially the British, would recognize. It's a peculiar amalgam of the Indo-British experience of 400 years of colonialism, of the ascent of English, of the mixture of our cultures, which have been Hun, Scythian, Parthian, Greek, Bactrian Greek, Turkish, Arabic. Of course, the original settlers, maybe in 3000 BC, who came from the steppes of Austro-Hungary and developed the Sanskrit language there, which has its, it's very close to Latin and some of the Germanic languages, and even to some of the Gaelic languages. Indians, at least I consider myself a very proud mongrel, a hybrid. There's been many Indian novelists who've written about India and the Indian situation and what it feels to live in India. There've been Isaac Babel would write, about Russia or Poland, or something like Chekhov would write, or Guy de Maupassant would write in French, essentially French thing. I tried to do something else, which it's a cliche now, but it's called a crossover piece. And I'll read first, if you permit me, 3 paragraphs, which is a self-assessment of what this novel was. In France, where the French imprint of the book, it was published by Cherche Midi, by the way, who also published Jules Verne, it won Le Prix Littéraire for the best foreign debut novel many years ago. It was the same award that went to Salman Rushdie for Shame. And the novel has been included in the French Le Livre Poche, the pocketbook edition of literature, and nominated for the prestigious Reader's Prize. In Holland, it's been published by Bestow in Dutch, Alianza in Spanish, and also in German by Fischer. And it's now being reissued by Fischer as part of a very large program they have for publishing or republishing what they consider to be the best 25 or 30 novels of the last decade. The author is a bridge between two vanished worlds. It could be me. It could be anybody who's had my experience. To which the protagonist of the novel remains the only living witness to these two vanished worlds. He describes and analyzes with a rare artistry. Some of these words are not written about myself, but they've been borrowed from different reviews of the book. And sensitivity, the lost world of feudal India of the 1950s, whose English-speaking middle class is captivated by American pop culture, and the now evanesced world of the counterculture generation of America, inspired by Hindu gurus, crypto-leftists, instant pundits. In Badhwar's novel, these two worlds embrace each other lovingly and without judgment, and produce in the protagonist a feeling of cathartic self-enlightenment. In the American world, the quest is to defeat death, while the Indian world seeks only to define death. My style, unlike the prose of the most recognized Indian authors, and that is often considered correct and Victorian, is free-flowing, experimental, and American. American sights and sounds and rhythms and accents leap to life. The influences of Henry Miller, Bellow, Singer, Nelson Algren, Ginsberg, Bukowski are evident in this novel. In fact, the genesis of the novel has a uniquely American inspiration, because I was immensely moved by Norman Maclean's novel, A River Runs Through It. Maclean captivated the whole world by painting an American epoch through the eyes of a Scott Presbyterian family of anglers in remote Northwest America. Inspired by Maclean's craftsmanship, I used a similar device to illustrate the epoch of the two effervescent, vanished worlds through a family of game bird hunters, shikaris, in a dust bowl town in northern India. To paraphrase Maclean, poets can talk about spots of time, Michael, but it's really hunters who experience eternity compressed into a moment. My readers experience these moments repeatedly, I hope, in the Chamber of Perfumes. I would now read a very short piece from the book, now that you know something of what it's about, right? Michael edited this rather well, I thought. Thank you, Michael. Okay.
It's not French.
It's
not French.
Talking about the family now. It's if you get the idea that there was a rootlessness in our family, a sense of ennui, a nagging feeling that we were hung between a world of tradition and a world of rapidly changing technologies, then I've given you the wrong impression. True. We were Midnight's children. Well, Midnight's children means people who were born after India attained independence from the British in 1947. So I know as Midnight's children. True. We were Midnight's children. True. We learnt and spoke English better than the king himself. True. We were the inheritors of educational, bureaucratic, cultural legacies of the Raj. We inherited snobbery, elitism. We realized we all lived in India in tribes of cultures. We were born in an India of 400 million people, 1/5 of mankind, a population that was to double within 40 years. Poverty, mostly poverty of a kind of urban ghettos, of rural privation, never witnessed in Europe or America or Tolstoy's Russia, but there was no guilt. We did not dangle between reason and revolution. We were not agonized by the existential dilemmas like the Jews of pre-World War II diaspora, whether to migrate to the Holy Land under the Palestine Mandate and take up Hebrew, whether to join the Bolsheviks in Russia to create the permanent revolution, whether to remain cloistered in Yiddish-speaking pockets in New York, or whether to assimilate with the Gentiles. No. We were not afflicted by the dilemma of the Fabians either, whether to sit in libraries and continue to make the revolution an esoteric exercise and indulge in theories of sovereignty from Hobbes to Bentham and Lasky, or to cut the bullshit and get onto the right side of the barricades with the masses. Nor did we torment ourselves like European intellectuals about which side to join during the Spanish Civil War. I mean, social historians may legitimately ask, weren't you torn between two cultures, several languages, the need to emulate Gandhian renunciation and bourgeois acquisitiveness and conspicuous consumption, to become the vanguard for the workers and the peasants, to reorder the political structure that was a British hand-me-down of constitutional legalisms? There was no dilemma, either invented or promulgated by the dictators of social conscience anywhere in the world that did not stare us in the face and threaten to drive us crazy. We were Veblen's leisure class. We were the Marxist-Leninist historical garbage that belonged in history's dustbins. We were the Indian left's lickspittle of neocolonialism and neo-imperialism. To India's populists and ultranationalists, we were the exponents of a corrupt urban culture who scoffed at their own roots. We stood guilty as charged. At least Papa did. And frankly, he didn't give a damned rat's ass. He had read Spinoza when young. He had armed himself with Churchill's volumes on the Second Great War. Trevelyan's Social History lay dog-eared on his bookshelf from the very first page on the analysis of Chaucer's age and the influence of the French on Anglo-Saxon culture. Another part of the book. Godless Papa, he was an atheist, did not inherit his atheism from Marxist literature. He considered communists boorish. He lumped them with soothsayers, mendicants, fortune-tellers, wandering sadhus, fake holy men, and assorted conmen and mahatmas who promised redemption, religious nirvana, a better tomorrow in the name of Hinduism, fooled women into accepting gurus. His concerns were more erudite. In those rare moments when he would care to explain himself, he would tell his friends that he admired those aristocratic Gentiles in Arthur Miller's Incident at Vichy, who had the courage to surrender themselves to the Nazis in order to protect Jews. We were later to learn that during India's post-partition riots, in which Hindus and Muslims slaughtered each other in their hundreds and thousands, perhaps even millions, over the creation of the separate countries of India and Pakistan, Papa, who detested religious states and Jinnah's version of Pakistan as much as he distrusted Hindu rituals, far more than a month hid a Muslim friend, a Razakar, Muslims involved in planting bombs and blowing up trains in India for the Pakistani cause. Today, I guess you'd call him a terrorist. In his private bathroom, later, when people asked repeatedly why he had taken the risk, he replied, he was a friend. The friend ultimately chose to remain in India with 50 million other Muslims who, 50 years later, doubled in size, making India a country with the second largest Muslim population in the world. Damn it, we mixed everything. Metaphors, philosophies, music, nursery rhymes, Victor Sylvester and his ballroom orchestra. Oh, Papa loved to foxtrot and tango and often dragged a petrified mama onto the dance floor once with a rose stem clenched in his teeth. Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, Benny Goodman stomping at the Savoy, Satchmo and Ella, Bhimsen Joshi and Bismillah Khan. Nothing was incongruous. Thank you. Mm-hmm.